All right. Hello and welcome. I'm Jing Zhao, Professor of City and Transportation at MIT. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum designed by the MIT Mobility Initiative. Today, we'll continue our discussion on the electric vehicle infrastructure development. I'm so glad that Professor Jing Li is joining us today to present her research on the entry and coordination of the US electric vehicle charging industry. I want to emphasize one expectation of the Mobility Forum. We do expect every audience to contribute one idea, either in the form of a question to Professor Jing Li or a comment to her research. Please do type your thoughts into the chat directly in that, right? Professor Jing Li is assistant professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. She holds the William Barton Rogers Career Development Chair of Energy Economics. For those who don't know, William Barton Rogers was the founder of MIT. It's a really prestigious chair. Professor Jing was a postdoc research associate at MIT Energy Initiative. Her research interests lie in the energy economics, industry organization, focusing on the development and adoption of new technology. Particularly in recent years, Jing has studied the standardization and location choice in the United States electric vehicle charging industry, which is today's topic, and automaker diesel vehicle emission control technology and cost pass-through in the E85 retail market. And he received his double degrees in mathematics and economics from MIT and her PhD in economics from Harvard. Right. Let me give 2 data points before I pass the forum to Professor Jing Li. The first one is, as of now, the United States as a whole have about 100K charging points in the country, and China has 4 million of them. Right. The second one, as part of IIJA, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's a $7.5 billion devoted to the charging infrastructure development. So is the free market sufficient, or does the urgent need of decarbonizing urban mobility system warrant the government intervention? And if so, what's the trade-off between subsidizing the car versus subsidizing the charging station? And more particularly, where do we position those charging stations? So now I pass the floor to Professor Jing Li to share her thoughts on this. Jing, please.
Thank you so much, Jinghua, for the opportunity to be with this audience. I'll start my share screen. Okay, this is joint work with Catalin Sprengel, who is at IIJA Montreal. And this is work in progress. So it's a perfect opportunity for us to be collecting comments and insights from all of you. And so I will preface by saying I'm going to appreciate all of your questions and comments. Okay, so we are thinking about the extent of entry and coordination that's occurring in the electric vehicle charging industry. And this matters for how government might think about how to design subsidy policies. And here's how we're thinking about it from the economic theory perspective. So when we think about entry decisions of businesses, there often are spillovers when a new business appears. And the spillovers that we might often think of are usually negative in the form of business dealing, right? So if I open up a gas station across the corner from an existing gas station, or if I open up a pizza shop, say a block away, or even on the same street, there might be business dealing. So the incumbent, the existing business, might not like new entry nearby or in specific distances away from me. But in particular network configurations or settings, there may be positive spillovers from entry. And so common examples we might have would be, say, a platform setting such as ride sharing or telecommunications, where you would appreciate having more drivers if you are a rider looking for a ride. And you might actually appreciate more drivers even if you are yourself a driver, because that might bring more riders to the platform. So that's an example of a positive spillover. And we're going to look for a specific form of positive spillovers in the electric vehicle charging setting, which might actually impact how government wants to think about designing subsidies. And if there are positive spillovers, pardon, did I? Okay, if there are positive spillovers, then that opens up the market to display something called inefficiently. By inefficient, I mean compared to how a social planner with the objective of maximizing social welfare might want to think about this. So the market might provide inefficiently low levels of entry if there are positive spillovers. it's kind of the same idea of why we have a patent system. If there are positive spillovers from ideas, we would want to incentivize market provision of something, such as in the market for ideas. Here, it would be the market for charging stations. So this project is going to focus on electric vehicle charging, and we want to ask whether the market is coordinating entry efficiently, and if we want to know whether targeted subsidies from government can improve market efficiency, or if instead we should have a uniform subsidy for electric vehicle charging, as in any entrant who wants to build a charging station should be eligible, or should subsidies be targeted to fill in so-called holes or underprovided areas in charging infrastructure. So here's a stylized example, and I will provide actual examples of configurations of cities and charging stations in the US in a few slides. So here's city S and T, and you might need to stop at 4 different places along the way to recharge your electric vehicle to travel this route between cities S and T. The open circles represent where charging stations already have entered. And if you have an electric vehicle of range that's barely enough to reach these distances between the dots that I've placed on this route, then you currently cannot drive between S and T because there's this hole in the route. So if an entrant contemplates coming in to fill this hole, they would be providing value to not just themselves from entering, they might be opening up this route S and T for EV drivers of this specific range, and therefore increasing demand at these other stations along the route. So that's our idea of how positive spillovers might exist in this market, and that's our hypothesis to test. So the last entrant to connect these dots might be able to increase the value of faraway incumbents, right? Even if, say, these are 100 miles away, the specific way that they're related to each other, the spatial relationship, when they sit on the same road, might mean that they have an impact on faraway incumbents. And then the last entrant's private value of entry is also going to depend on which incumbents already exist, right? So this last entrant here thinks about filling in the hole on the route, but if they're the first entrant on this route, then they also need to think about what is the possibility of other incumbents, or sorry, other charging stations that might come in the future. So if you combine the existence of positive spillovers, which we're going to test for, and kind of an assumption, or we could check in the market of how charging station locations think about entry, whether they're independent or if they're making coordinated decisions across these locations, then you could get inefficiently low entry provided by the market, which then is a justification for subsidies to be designed in a targeted manner to try to fix this specific spatial pattern of inefficiently low entry. And so I am using the current design of the US IIJA portion of support for EV charging as motivation for how to think about which way policy should go. In the US, the memo for how to spend the $5 billion out of the total $7.5 billion dedicated EV charging is currently specified to go for supporting charging stations every 50 miles along US interstate highways. And I think there are similar proposals in Europe, for example, aiming for charging stations every 150 kilometers along highways. So our Secretary of Transportation says right now it's patchy. There are some places where you wouldn't have a problem and other places where you would. And so the goal of the NEVI formula for how to spend this $5 billion is to fill in where the government perceives there to be holes or patches. On the other end of this discussion, I'm growing increasingly embarrassed of even quoting anything by this person due to other unrelated things unrelated to the EV industry. But anyway, so Elon Musk then clearly does not like this policy because the US government will be kind of supporting entry of competitors of Tesla's charging stations, which they've spent a lot of resources building over the past decade. And I'll show you maps in a moment of how different charging networks have located their infrastructure. So there's the cynical first interpretation of Elon Musk's opposition of the government policy, which is that he doesn't want government support of firms that from his perspective, could have just as easily built their own infrastructure over the last 10 years. But if you kind of try to put aside the cynicism for a moment, there is an interesting question of how network markets grow, and do they ever evolve in an efficient way, or is it just that in the electric vehicle context, the government actually has an incentive to take a closer look, but in fact, in every network market, we have the potential for inefficiently low or inefficiently provided variety for locations. Okay, so our research questions again are whether there are positive spillovers across electric vehicle charging sites, and if so, what are charging networks doing about it? So do we think the firms that are one layer above the charging sites, these networks, are they doing the coordination activity that we might think they have the incentive to do? And then lastly, what should the how should the government funding be allocated? Should it be very targeted in this kind of spatial structure of every 50 miles, or just anybody who thinks it's worth their while to enter, who wants a little bit of help to, say, internalize environmental externalities, get an entry subsidy? So we will show you 2 reduced form tests of our hypothesis of the positive spillovers. One is at the station level and one is at the route level. And I expect only to do this portion in the allotted time for me. But I suppose the other portion of the project that's in progress is also included in the slides, which you can browse later. And I'm happy to chat later on about the remaining parts of the project. So today I will show you the reduced form tests, as I said, and then sketch out the model. I'll skip the literature in the interest of time. And just for this crowd, I don't even have to spend that much time on the industry background either, but I want to be clear about which data sets we're working with. So there are charging stations that we are defining as a collection of charging posts in a specific site. And the reason we have to be thinking about how to define even what is a charging station is because when you think of a gas station, they have their own street address. And if you go to any kind of geospatial data set, they have their own polygon in space. Charging stations are not quite like that because they're just charging posts that sit next to parking spots. And those parking spots are affiliated with some other main business very often. So a charging station in our working definition is a collection of charging posts that are hosted somewhere. And that charging station site host may be independent or affiliated with a network. So in this picture here, this is the ChargePoint logo. And this collection of 4 charging posts is one charging station and how we're working with this data. And I want to point out that there still exist 3 different fast charging standards in the US, level 3 charging, although the majority of stations that we see in the data are turning into kind of dual standard between CHAdeMO and combo. So it's kind of de facto like 2 separate networks in some sense. So if for a given vehicle, electric vehicle that you drive, you can access only a subset of charging stations that have been built in the US for fast charging. And also for the highway spillover test that we are going to show you, this is focusing on fast charging. I also can point out that as a Tesla driver, they would be able to buy adapters that Tesla has developed to access the other standards, but those adapters do not exist for non-Tesla drivers to access Tesla's stations or even within CHAdeMO and combo. Okay, and then retail prices are set sometimes by the site hosts and sometimes by the network that they're affiliated with. It depends on who owns that station exactly, and then also how the charging network is organized. So for example, Tesla is vertically integrated, whereas other networks are not. The price structure varies widely in our data. They can be linear, so unit of electricity times price or time plugged in times price. They could be nonlinear, so maybe the second hour gets you a different price or the 10th kilowatt hour is a different price, and they may also be time of use rates. We see these more in California. And as I've already kind of alluded to, they can be in functions of energy delivered or time plugged in. And charging site hosts vary in their primary purpose. So the biggest category is some kind of a shopping or retail setting. And then parking garages, where the main business is to sell space for parking, is also a big one. Gas stations are kind of growing as a share of the type of business offering charging stations. And I kind of skipped over car dealerships because some of these are kind of misclassified as public, even though they're not actually so accessible to the public. Car dealers use these infrastructure themselves for recharging in between test drives and so on. So here's a map showing how charging network companies differ in their build out strategies. This starts to get you thinking about what are the networks doing in coordinating the locations on their networks, right? So Electrify America and Tesla, when you go onto their websites, try to make it very clear. My takeaway as a potential driver using these networks is that they're connecting the highways and I should be able to travel the routes between major cities. Whereas ChargePoint and Blink, although they may have underlying stations that actually enable the same trips as these two other networks, are not at least emphasizing that aspect of their network when they display their information to a driver. So here are the data sets we're ultimately going to be using. First, we want to know travel patterns, and we're not getting as detailed as some of you might be used to in transit and planning. So we only want to roughly know from a given city, here a census block group, what is sort of the distribution of distances that people are driving and in which directions. So we're not thinking about like a detailed of traffic flow at any given minute, but we want to know, say, like how often do people who live in Boston who might have EVs ever actually show up in Kansas, where I grew up as a kid. And so safe graph data from mobile data allows us to understand how often people kind of for a given place that they live ever visit some other census block group or establishment. Then we will eventually need to take into account vehicle demand. And this is coming from vehicle registration data, which we have from 2013 to the present, including the home zip code of the vehicle where it's registered and vehicle characteristics. Then there are charging locations and attributes. This is mainly from the Alternative Field Data Center at NREL, and it includes entry date, GPS coordinates, connector counts and types and prices for some stations, the network affiliation, and the amenities nearby. And then lastly, what very important for our hypothesis testing is how much charging stations are used. We don't have the most amazing or perfect measure of charging station utilization. So if anyone in the crowd has access to, say, session level charging data or energy delivered, I would love to talk to you further. For now, we have station status at every 30-minute intervals. So we'll know whether a connector is in use or available or out of service. And we have this information for all of the US from 2015 and 2016 for some networks, and for one network from last November to the present. We're scaling up our collection to beyond California at the moment. And then we also have check-in data from a crowdsourced third-party app from the beginning of the US EV industry to the present day. And this is also kind of a rough or imperfect measure of utilization, but to the extent that we want to know changes and relative utilization of sites across each other, this is also a useful data source. Okay, so I'll describe our empirical test. So the first one is at the station level, and the question is, if you take a given station that is already in the market and you draw rings around it of different distances, and then you look at what happens to this central station as new ones come in different distance rings away. That's the first charging station test. Do we see positive impacts on the incumbent utilization? So that might be the positive spillover we're talking about. Or do we see business stealing, so negative impacts on the incumbent station? This is the econometric estimating equation. So utilization is represented by the variable y, and then the entrants coming in at different distance bands d is what we're testing for. Okay. I won't dwell on the econometric identification comments, but I can say that we're going to use different charging standards as a placebo test. So you would expect a charging station entering that's on a different standard from the incumbent charging station of interest to have zero impact on the incumbent. Whereas if they share standards, then that's where business stealing or positive spillovers might actually appear. And before I show you our preliminary findings, you might also just wonder at what distance bands do we even expect to see anything? So here's a distribution of the visitors at charging stations that are fast chargers on highways in our sample, and the electric ranges of those visitors. So we're going to be looking at the 75 to 150 distance band to see what impacts are. So here's the first result. This is preliminary and we're adding robustness tests. So please do not go and make policy directly from this. I want you to take away the idea of positive spillovers. So here we're seeing that if you add a station 75 to 150 miles away, the utilization of an existing charging station during peak hours increases by 0.49 percentage points or 3.1%. And we don't see impacts at closer distances. And the confidence interval is very wide for closer distances. So this is just in the data, we don't see charging stations entering close by to an existing one. We do not see evidence of business stealing at short distances, but again, it's noisy because there's not even that much entry happening at short distances. And then we could test the impact of a different standard, and we don't see any impacts as expected. And the exception is that if we unpack the 0 to 5 band into 1 mile bands, we see a positive impact of entry from a different standard when they come in within 1 mile away from an existing station. And we interpret that as common demand shocks, right? So something's happening to the very local electric vehicle charging market to make lots of people want to enter. We still don't think that there should be any interaction across standards. Then with very quickly, a few minutes of time, I want to show you our route level analysis, which has taken a lot of time. We had to set up the geospatial relationship of charging stations relative to roads and to each other. So I showed you a station level analysis of one station and rings around it. Averaged over many stations, not just a single one. We can also do this at the route level, which is following more closely the stylized example that I started with. And so the question is, if you have an incumbent, an existing charging station in between two cities, and for a given electric vehicle range, there are holes on that route, what happens when the last entrant comes in and connects that route for a given EV distance? So here's an example, my hometown, Lawrence, Kansas, to Chicago, Illinois, which is a big city that we often would drive to. In 2019, this route would have been difficult to reach, and the website, A Better Route Planner, highlighted this segment as at risk of running out of juice before you get to the next charging station. By 2021, an entrant has come in the middle here. It's in Bethany, Missouri, and that kind of might make you more comfortable with taking this whole trip. So comments about this Bethany, Missouri entrant include things like, oh, it works. Now I can get from Des Moines to Kansas City without major range anxiety. Very happy to see this charging void getting filled for non-Teslas and so on. And then I made a figure of one specific user's charging patterns. So the lime green dot is the entrant. The dark green dots here are where the user was charging before the Bethany, Missouri charging station entered. And then afterwards, any new stations where we see them charging are the red dots here. So of course, in this specific user's case, maybe something changed in their life so that their driving patterns changed. But we're asking, if you aggregate this up to more people, do you see that a new entrant kind of enables these new trips that they previously didn't take, averaging across things like maybe individual changes in life circumstance. So here's another example, San Jose to Santa Barbara, which I've colored in blue. This is not connected at the 50-mile range level. And then in May of 2022, that last station comes in that makes this route possible with the 50-mile range charge distance, maximum charge distance. And it happens to be an Electrify America station in Los Alamos. So the question is, when these last special entrants come in, what happens to the utilization of charging stations along the way? So we can define the set of origins and destinations as all the FHWA adjusted urban areas. There are 493 of them, and do this kind of analysis for a range of ranges. So 50 miles, 70 miles. Say you have a long range EV, so 130 miles maybe, and so on. So we have very preliminary evidence right now. This is the econometric estimating equation. So we find that an entrant that comes in that kind of electrifies or finishes a route at the 50-mile interval increases incumbent utilization by 0.63 percentage points or 25%. So that's like a quarter more of business than you previously had. This is, again, very preliminary, so don't quote me on this quite yet. We're doing robustness tests, but that's the idea that we're testing for. And our next question is, do charging networks help to coordinate charging locations, right? So given that I've shown you charging stations might have spillovers on each other, do we think the government should be helping to coordinate entry, or do we think the charging networks are already doing a good job? And that's what we're in the progress of working on now. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here so that we can have a dialogue. So I will move to this conclusion slide to say that from an economist perspective, we think that the specific way we see US IIJA policy being designed can be rationalized by the existence of positive entry spillovers, and our preliminary findings show that there are positive entry spillovers across locations, although our next step is to dig into what the network firms, the charging networks, are doing about these spillovers and whether we still think that there's something missing for the government to play a role in. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Jing Li. Before I start my question, I want to acknowledge that there's several experts in this electric vehicle field in the audience today. Professor Scott Tamura, Professor Dan Spurling, Professor Jim Womack. So if you like, please feel free to chime in at your remarks, right? So I'll start with a few questions with Jing first. Jing, on the slides 15, where you report the first major empirical finding about this half percentage point increase of utilization, if we're adding one station here, right? I assume that's average across the entire network that you studied, right? Do you find a major variation in such effect across any dimension that may be relevant in this, right? The second question on this point also is this is kind of a point estimate, right? So here I'm interested in, if you're adding the second station, the third station, do you expect a major marginal effect diminishing going on here, or this is a reasonable flat part, right? So that's the first part of the empirical question. I'd like to get you elaborate a bit more.
Right. Okay. Thanks. So I think if you are, so this is just about distances from an existing charging station. So your question is like, so if an entrant comes in this band and they're the second one or the fifth one, or if they're coming into this distance band and they're second and the fifth, I think that I have to recheck my results, but I seem to recall there were diminishing returns to additional stations within a given band. And then the same question can be asked of the route level analysis, right? So if you have already a string of dots at given distances between two cities, what happens if you kind of densify it? We haven't, I don't have solid estimates that I feel comfortable sharing. So we'll take a look.
How about the first part, which is the variation of this effect across different geographics, different networks, or any other dimension that may influence this?
Yes, this is an average. So it's statistically significant, but there's high variation in the impacts if you were to zoom in on. So the more you zoom in on a specific area of the country, the more we lose data and lose statistical precision. But there is significant heterogeneity across regions and across networks in these impacts that we're estimating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So second really question is about the motivation of this is to say the IIJA, does this positive spillover justify a certain subsidy from the government, right? So the subsidy design now is mostly a function of just a quantity, but does your research suggest that the subsidy may come with certain locational constraint, saying that the these subsidies it can be qualified if under such geographic patterns, for example. Does that make sense, or this is too complicated to even think about?
So my understanding is that the IIJA, the memo that came after the IIJA actually specifies quite a location targeted design. And I'm asking whether economic theory or evidence can provide a justification for that specific way of designing subsidies. So I think the existing way of how we're planning to spend the $5 billion is actually quite specific. And you can imagine an alternative where it's not so specific, like any charging station that wants to enter could be receiving a subsidy. And for that, you only need the environmental benefits to justify kind of a uniform subsidy. I'm looking for additional spatial inefficiencies in what the market is providing.
Thanks. Yeah. Then that's one part of the government intervention side. On the purely private sector side, between the different networks, what do you see their coordination going here? Are they naturally coordinating in an efficient way, or there's clear issues that the different parties are not really working towards a common goal?
Right. This is maybe the best slide to kind of stare at while I talk a bit. So we have some preliminary analysis that we looked at. So what we did following the route level analysis was to say, for every given city pair, let's define a dominant network. So how many level 3 charging stations are there in between city A and B? And suppose that dominant network is Electrify America. And then we look at when a route goes from not connected to connected for a given EV distance, say 50 miles or 70 miles, how often does that new entrant share the dominant network versus is it on a different network, right? So if you think that there are spillovers across sites, then networks should be thinking about building strings of stations rather than kind of plopping down random ones in the middle of nowhere. And so we see that when the entrant is kind of the special last one that connects a route, they're more likely to share the dominant network compared to if they're just an entrant that's further densifying a network versus if they're not the last one to be connecting the network, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think there's certainly a bit of, I mean, you could tell from the maps themselves that there can't be a non-zero amount of coordination. And we find some evidence of coordination being done by the networks themselves. And we're kind of trying to figure out a nice way of quantifying that on a numerical scale so that you could take a network and say, like, how much coordination is happening on it. I see. Oh, thanks. Yeah. Another question is, as we know that, say, even the gas stations typically do not make money, right? And they often the revenue come from the auxiliary function there. EV charging wise seems also it's very hard for them to make money on the charging per se. So what this means is many of these networks need to survive based on kind of a secondary business logic, right? There's something addition to the charging, but either bring the customer or there's part of a broader business strategy there, right? Does that change this calculation here? It certainly should matter what their auxiliary business or what other amenities are. From a modeling perspective, we're thinking that whatever other business that you are trying to kind of optimize over and EV charging helps with that, it's still better if you have a more useful station in where it's located, or you want to maximize foot traffic so that you get to sell more groceries or whatever. So if we're thinking about charging stations as, do they pick a location that's useful for people and that they are maximizing foot traffic, which then is like positively correlated with revenue from whatever thing they're selling on site. And then in terms of comparing to costs, that's where everything has to get scaled, right? So if you see that charging is across the board not going to help you get over the threshold of making entry worthwhile, then there's whatever difference we assume has to be made up by either subsidies or other on-site amenities where they're making money. I see.
Thanks. Yeah. So the last question from me, I will encourage more audience continue to add your comments and questions to that. And John will curate that question to Jing. So that's about from the network effect point of view. Clearly, we want the entire country have one single standard. Everybody's open to everybody, so it's totally compatible to each other, right? Just imagine if in the gasoline world where each car brand has its own gas station, what would be a miserable situation? But in the EV side, right, at least we have the Tesla versus everybody else's situation here, if not more. But here, so the one argument is saying, how about we force Tesla to open the network to the rest with the reasonable pricing structure? Or we say if we do too much of that, then there will be no such a Tesla to invest initially into the infrastructure, right? So what's your thinking on this, both the standard compatibility, but also the meaningful incentive to motivate the individual to contribute while reasonable benefit, while still maintain this interoperability across the entire network?
Thanks. So I analyzed this issue about standards compatibility in my dissertation work. And I found that for a given standard, of course, they would like to be able to have their drivers access the other standards, but they would not like to provide that same reciprocal benefit. So that means if you leave the market to decide on standards and compatibility on its own, when you have the option of doing this kind of one-sided adapter, that means no firm has the incentive to provide compatibility or two-sided compatibility, right? So it would show up in the way that we see how the market has evolved, which is that Tesla built an adapter for their drivers to be able to use other people's stations, but not the other way around. So from a policy perspective, we don't have, in general, a precedent of mandating standardization and compatibility. It tends to be, across many industries, it tends to be something we've left up to industries to sort out on their own through industry standard setting organizations. But Europe has decided to pick kind of a de facto winner and to say that any charging site has to have at least the standard that we've picked. And I think that's then served to kind of move the market towards that, coalesce towards that equilibrium. And so that, I think, is in part how the US government has specified the $5 billion spending, which is that it's only accessible to charging stations that are more open to more brands of cars, which kind of then explicitly excludes Tesla for now. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Thanks, Jing. I will give it to John for the audience question. John, please.
Super. Okay, we have had a very active chat right now. We're getting some feedback.
You can use this.
Okay. Great. Is that better? Okay. So we have.
I don't think you've muted. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry about that. We had a little technical issue over here. So at Jing, we had a super active chat. Lots of comments, lots of questions. As Jing mentioned, we have some really great people on the line. So I'd actually like to reach out to them directly to pose a super short, perhaps, reaction and also pose a question. So I'd like to start with Don McKenzie from University of Washington. He runs the Sustainable Transport Lab. Don, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here, John. Thank you.
Super.
Yeah, so I'd sort of reacted to some of the really good questions in the chat about the economics and how this pencils out. And I think one of the things we've been looking at in our work is the how important increased utilization is. And I don't know that that's how directly relevant it is here, but it is one of the challenges certainly to get into these things to pencil out. And I guess this is more responsive to some of the side conversations that were going on. And you really have this trade-off, I think, when we're thinking about station spacing, where there's greater consumer convenience if you get these things, everywhere you want them. But on the other hand, it gets harder if you're dispersing that demand. And a lot of that comes from the line extension charges, the utilities charge, as well as the demand charges. And it's easier to kind of spread those over more users while retaining reliable access if you've got a larger scale of operations. So that was one thought. I did have a question for Jing too, and I apologize if I missed this, but it seems like one of the reasons you might see these spillovers on nearby or somewhat nearby stations could be that you're inducing new travel. So you're motivating more people to make the trip by EV and then charge at other stations along the way. But the other is, what if people have two corridors they could choose between two different routes, and you're really just drawing people off the other route? And in that case, you'd have a positive spillover on other stations on your corridor, but a negative spillover on the other corridor. And I'm sorry if you mentioned this and I missed it, but is that something that would be worth digging into, and what would be the implications of that if so?
Thank you, Don, very much. I'm just scrolling through the chat now, and I see that you helped, usually it's the job of a co-author, but thank you for doing all these, answering all these questions for me while I was talking. So to answer your question about the multiple corridors, so the short answer is we're not taking that into account at the moment, but I agree with you that that's very important. So the example of Lawrence to Chicago, for example, that was a part of the example that I cut out where you could have gone down through St. Louis, although I don't know many family friends who take that route. But in any case, your question is an important point of that maybe there are negative spillovers on other charging stations and other corridors. But I think maybe it's an important question to be asking in the short run of the early stage of the EV industry. In the long run, if every corridor has already been built out, then I guess we would just say, like, what is the market share we expect for a given city pair of origin and destination along the multiple options? So we could analyze this by using the existing market shares across corridors now between cities to say, like, how much are we deviating from that? Yeah, thanks.
Super. Okay, thank you so much. I know Dan Sperling's on the line as well, and Dan is going to be with the forum next week. Dan, I don't know if you have
I think he just left.
Oh, he's left. Okay, gotcha. All right, let me move to Jim Womack from MIT. We've been doing some work on this question here. Jim, do you have any a reaction and perhaps a question for Jing?
Well, first, I'm delighted that people at MIT, not to name a specific university, but that people at MIT are building up the capability to do sophisticated analysis, because this is not actually a short-run issue. I think myself that the gap issue is actually a fairly short-run issue, that east of the Mississippi, there's plenty of money in NEVI to fill in all the gaps, so that the 50-mile sort of thing, I think, becomes something in the rearview mirror. But as we try to bring an enormous number of new vehicles onto a system where no one has yet figured out how to make any money, it seems to me there are big public policy questions about what the most efficient thing to do is. And so starting with this relatively simple problem that I think diminishes over time, the real payoff from the type of analytics that Jing is trying to build the capability on is that we get to some big decisions not very far down the line about what kind of support is going to be needed to make this charging network work. If it turns out not to be a attractive business proposition, that there has to be some sort of backstopping. And there are a number of ways to do it, that the car companies could in some way be forced to do what Tesla's doing, which is to collectively put in a subsidy so that they can sell their vehicles. And when I say forced, they might be forced by market conditions that they just can't sell all of these new vehicles that will be in the market in the next 3 or 4 years unless they take a collective effort to raise the level of capability of the network. So I think it's a great start. Delighted that MIT is doing the right thing for society. Hope that will continue. Hope to have some very modest role in it myself. And by the way, hello to Don McKenzie and all the other people that we've worked with over the years. Great to see that we're all still on the journey, trying to get to a happy ending.
Super, thanks, Jim. So there was a question from Marty Schlenker that I think is quite interesting. So it seems like the build out of EV charge capability has a parallel in the build out of cell towers now close to 25 years ago. Are records available to depict the cell tower build out over time? And I think the essence of this question is more about, in your research, Jing, have you looked at the rollout in other networks, and maybe perhaps you have some observations from those other networks where you can draw some parallels to the electric vehicle charging network?
Yeah, thanks, Marty, for the question. And I also want to quickly thank Jim for your generous interpretation of our work and the direction that it's headed in. And I totally agree with you. And what motivated us to go after all of these data that have taken forever to gather and stuff is because we want to understand how is the market functioning. And we think policy should be built based on understanding what the market is already doing. And so Marty, thanks for the question about the build out of kind of other network settings. I've looked into this, and the short answer is that I haven't been able to find as much detailed data as is available in the market that we're focused on, the charging industry. But I've looked at cell towers and the rollout of, say, gas station retail back in the day, and I found descriptive evidence that it was kind of like wherever the population was densest, it kind of goes out in a spatial pattern from there. But to understand kind of who's doing that investment and how many firms there were and all that stuff, I was not able to find the detailed data I would need.
Excellent. Well, speaking of gas stations, Claude Morelli, who always has great comments and questions, made reference of that. It would be interesting to see how charging at gas stations plays out. But Claude also had a question: how would topography and climate impact this analysis, if at all? If EV range correlates with these, charging locations should as well. Will mountainous, cold regions need more charging infrastructure than flat, hot ones, for example? So any thoughts or reactions on the climate and topography question?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I agree with you that that is really important richness. We just haven't gotten far enough in the analysis to add that kind of detail. So for example, right now, when I link a charging station to a road, I'm not keeping track of on which side of the road it is, but you could imagine that if you're going up the mountain, you want more charging stations on that side versus if you're going down. And we're not capturing that kind of richness at the moment. But I was thinking about how to kind of take advantage of that variation in geography in maybe helping us kind of create as good as random variation and thinking about econometric identification of something.
Super. Okay. Perhaps another question on methodology. This is from Daniel Binion. And the question is, as far as the route level analysis, how is a charging station determined to be on a route? Is it based on certain distance from the highway? If the latter, how sensitive are the estimates to variation in the preset distance from the highway?
Thanks, that's a great question. So the preliminary analysis I'm doing is using half a mile away. So the way that the US government defines an EV corridor, it used to be if a charging station was half a mile away from the highway, and recently I think it's been updated to if it's 0.1 miles away. So our plan is to do both, and I can report back on the robustness in the future. But from my preliminary work, I didn't think that there were that many stations that were outside of half a mile that we would have wanted to include.
Okay, super. Question from Alex Curtis, which is, are the private charging companies fighting in a race to the bottom that won't be reversed unless users are more greatly subsidized to purchase and use EVs due to things like greater number of public charging stations, higher number of TVs, not the road, etc. Any Any thoughts on this concept of a race to the bottom for private charging companies?
I'm interpreting this question as about the frequency with
Alex,
which
if
you might
you're not-
encounter a
if you want to
broken
jump
one.
on, please feel free to clarify. I'm trying to capture your question
Mhm.
accurately.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Professor Jing for the wonderful presentation. So I guess my question is more sort of like, how do you see, like, what direction is it going to go in the end? Like, is it going to be dominated by private chargers, or is there going to be the government or whoever is going to be successful in lobbying for or subsidizing these stations so that you know, you don't have basically anything nearing like Tesla dominating the market and having anything close to like a monopoly, anything like that?
Mhm. Thanks, Alex. I just looking at the just thinking back to the maps that I was showing earlier. I don't get the sense that the market is like on the cusp of turning into a monopoly, at least at the moment. And there are lots of papers where people have asked like how tippy is the EV market, and I think it's actually not so tippy. And like with social networks or whatever, like they could be amazing in one day and then all the users could have fled the next day. But with EV charging, we have actual cars that people have bought that only work with a subset of stations. And these stations are real infrastructure. So I think there's going to be variation over time in how well they're maintained, but I don't think from the data that I'm working with that we have like networks that are on the cusp of getting all acquired by Tesla or rolled into a different network per se. I am concerned about the uptime at different stations, and we have data on those, but they're not currently in our estimates.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one more question. I'll turn it back to Jinhua after. This is a great question from Adam Rosenfield. Adam, I don't know if you're with us because you could ask the question directly about electricity demand charges. Are you still on?
Yes,
Okay.
sorry, just finding the unmute button.
You bet.
Yeah,
Sorry to
no,
push you on the spot. It's always nice to hear from people directly. What's your question?
no, for sure. Thanks, Professor Lee. Here, let me turn on here. Yeah, so I've been working in Ontario and building out a network of public EV chargers, and we're hearing from a lot of the operators that they want the capital money to help build them, but even once they open, they're not going to be able to fund the operations of them because the demand charges are so high. And again, that's just whatever fee is paid for the peak demand as opposed to the electricity used. And so that only really you balance that out with revenue when utilization goes up. But to solve that in the shorter term, is the solution kind of more of a regulatory rate structure reform as opposed to just providing capital money up front, which governments like to do? And how do we sort of solve that problem if people don't even want to put these things in because they know they'll be straddled with huge operational costs?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I agree with you. This is a really important question. I've thought about this issue kind of outside the context of the spatial spillovers analysis that I presented today. And I think that for a data-based analysis, I really need more detailed kind of hour by hour data at charging stations. With the data that we currently have, what I could get pretty close to kind of backing out demand charges if I've, so, okay, let me first say that I have not been able to finish gathering like a comprehensive data set of what the demand charge policies are across different places in the US. So that would be super helpful if anyone in the crowd already has that available. Then from the data that I have, I could tell you what is the maximum number of connectors that I see in use at a given charging station over the course of, say, a billing period. And I know the power output of every connector, so I could kind of tell you, okay, like in this month, I saw that in 1.5 hour window, all of the connectors were in use. So that's the demand charge that the station likely faces. So I would be able to back out kind of demand charges coupled with the data set of what those policies are. And then in terms of like what then to do about that information, energy economists much more senior than I have long been writing op-eds about the inefficiencies of demand charge generally, not just in the EV industry. and they find it to be a very inefficient way to recover capital costs for the utility. So I'll just parrot that as kind of the general consensus from my profession. Now, we're probably a long ways away from reforming that generally and how utilities recover costs. So to the extent that we want to think about how we want to modify policy for the EV sector, critical peak pricing is something that energy economists say is a nice kind of either complement or alternative to demand charges. So maybe that's something to consider. So we don't have demand charges always, but only when the grid is actually stressed, for example. Or to think about actually how demand is responsive to pricing at the charging station and whether it's possible to try to have the charging station coordinate demand so that they don't get these peaks. That's the extent that I can offer at the moment. Thanks, Adam.
Great.
I'd love to chat more in the future with you if you're available.
Yeah, thank you, Jing. The hour flies by so quickly. I really appreciate Professor Jing Li for your research and also sharing the findings with us. Once you get a more detailed empirical finding, I'll invite you again to share more of your understanding of that, right? So a quick advertising for the next 2 sessions. Next week, Professor Dan Spurling will continue the conversation, talk about electric vehicle policy and the pitfalls. And the last one, Professor Dan Frood will talk about the supply of autonomous vehicles in open platform. So finally, please everyone join me. Thank Professor Jing Li for the presentation and conversation. Thank you very much, Jing Li. Everybody, see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.